Good evening. Welcome to the gallery room of the State Library of New South Wales, everyone. My name is Rita and I'm from the Parliament's Education and Engagement team. We're hosting this event at this venue today because our Parliament is currently undergoing critical maintenance and safety works. If there is an emergency, we will be directed by our State Library colleagues. In terms of tonight's program, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly will be opening the event very shortly, after which Professor O'Connor will give his presentation. We have all set aside time for audience questions at the end. I'm going to call upon Mr. Speaker to officially open this event.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rita. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. I just walked out of my office, which is amidst all the renovations that you can see along Macquarie Street of the New South Wales Parliament, but it will look so good when it reopens with the new Parliament on the 9th of May this year. And you know that you can all come in and visit Parliament. It's easily accessible. You just have to get through a little bit of a security bit. But I picked up on the way out of my office the American flag. So I normally wave the New South Wales flag, which not a lot of people recognise, or the Australian flag, but tonight I thought I'd bring along this and now I can put away my prop. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Jonathan O'Day, and I'm here as the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the New South Wales Parliament's lower house. I'm also the member for Davidson for another 2 days, and that's an electorate which covers the Northern Beaches and North Shore of Sydney, and I'm actually retiring as the local member as at the election, but I continue as Speaker until the new Parliament comes back, and as I said, that's on the 9th of May, and the first thing that the new Parliament will do will elect my replacement. But what I do every day when we meet in the Legislative Assembly is start the proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And I do that now, acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we pay respects to their elders, past and present, and also acknowledge the traditional owners' continued contribution to life in this great city of Sydney and state of New South Wales. And if you're a frequent visitor to Parliament, you'll certainly know that we open our events also with an acknowledgement for country or sometimes a welcome to country. And we do that in recognition of the fact that it was our institution, the Parliament of New South Wales, that made legislation and endorsed policies that did cause and continue in some cases to cause our first Australians harm and distress. And so we do that also with the belief that a more positive future will be achieved when we face and learn from our past. And in turn, that acknowledgement also reminds us of the significant powers and responsibilities that are vested in the Parliament and the government in our Westminster system. And those powers and responsibilities, of course, ultimately emanate from the people. Each member of Parliament is elected by their constituents, and in turn, it's the party or the coalition of parties with the majority of members that forms government. And of course, we are about to undertake that very process this Saturday. It's therefore appropriate, highly appropriate, that the Parliamentary Education and Engagement team has been putting together this series of talks on the themes of voting and democracy. And it's certainly my pleasure to be with you here tonight to officially open the third presentation of that series, Democracy in Crisis, USA, a Case Study. And tonight's event will compare our voting system and that of the United States, and will highlight those aspects of our democracies that protect our systems of government, as well as those things that may affect them in unexpected ways. And I'd now like to introduce our special guest speaker, who is able to speak on this topic and issue far more expertly than myself. Indeed, I can't think of a better person to discuss this topic than Brendon O'Connor. Brendon's the Professor of US Politics and US Foreign Relations. He's jointly appointed between the United States Studies Centre and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in the discipline of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. Professor O'Connor has been recently appointed also Deputy Head of School. He's a highly respected researcher and educator on US domestic politics, and has written and edited numerous books and articles on American welfare policy, presidential politics, US foreign policy, and Australian-American relations. I therefore have no doubt that he'll present tonight a highly engaging and informative presentation, and I'm sure there'll be opportunity for a bit of exchange at the end. I sincerely hope that you all enjoy this evening and learn something new about our democracy as well as that of the United States. And on that note, I'm going to hand over now to Professor O'Connor, but please join with me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Well, thanks for the welcome and thanks for coming out. A few familiar faces in the crowd, a couple of students. It's good to see. It's a great venue, this. I've gone to a few talks here, and it's great to see the sort of preserved reading rooms and the like. So I'm happy to be here, but next time possibly in the Parliament, it would be great when that's renovated. I was going to start by saying, look, I'm here from the US Studies Centre to talk about the superiority of the American electoral system. I thought that would be a good way to win over the crowd. And, you're about to go to an election, most of you to vote on Saturday, many of you. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about really some of the comparative strengths of the Australian system over the American system, some of the problems that the American system has had in recent times, most dramatically in the beginning of the of 2021, when you saw the occupation of the US Capitol building, which was really a culmination of an attack on the American electoral system, an unwillingness to accept an electoral result, a creation of, I suppose, a group of people who saw the election of Joe Biden as illegitimate. So we're going to backtrack and look at the sort of how healthy the state of American democracy is. And then we're going to look at, for some of us who are into electoral studies or studying politics, voting, particularly electoral maps around this time of the year of elections become fascinating things as you pore over which boundary am I in. I'm on the border of 3 electorates, and I thought, well, if only I was a little bit further over, I would get to vote there, or if the map changed. So for those of you who are fascinated by electoral history, results, the actual process of voting, you're in the right place. We're going to talk a lot about that tonight. So the first point I want to make is about a general point about the healthiness or unhealthiness of democracies. And I suppose one of the best books that's come out in recent years is this book by Levitsky and Zablet about the health of American democracy largely, which builds a model and has a model to say, how do democracies stay strong? What are the key sort of pillars of a strong democracy? And I'm going to go through those in a minute, and I'm really going to talk about one pillar, and that's really playing by the rules of the electoral system. But before we get into these 4 pillars that I'm going to talk about in the electoral system, I think it's useful for us to stand back a bit and think, okay, American democracy has gone through, I think, some pretty hard times in the last few years, but it is, I think, a mistake to think, well, all was well beforehand. If only the period before Donald Trump could be returned, American democracy was in great shape. And similarly with our own democracy in Australia, you could say there have been clearly periods of excluding Indigenous people in the United States, excluding African Americans for a long part of American history. If you think of before the Voting Rights Act in 1964, about 5% of eligible African Americans in Mississippi were voting. So this is not, something to say, well, all was well before Donald Trump came along. There are many things that you might be critical about our own democracy, American democracy. The very term gerrymander is a very old one. It comes from Governor Jerry with a G, who was governor of Massachusetts, signing in a bill which allowed for an electorate that looked like a salamander. I once walked into a secondhand bookshop in the Gold Coast and I got talking with someone and they asked me what I did and they said, I've always wanted to know two things in life about American politics. What's a gerrymander and what's a filibuster? And I said, well, I'm the right person to ask. It's good to be useful, particularly on the Gold Coast. You don't usually get those kinds of, that kind of feeling that you're in the right industry. But bring this point up with gerrymandering, and in the Australian case, malapportionment is something we've had a long history with in Queensland and South Australia during the Playford government, are things that people might look back on and say, well, that wasn't particularly democratic if you believe in one person, one vote, or all votes being equally weighted. There's even a debate, of course, to be had about the US Senate or the Australian Senate. There are many places that you can throw sort of stones, and all of us are probably still, when it comes to democracy, in somewhat of glass houses. So that's sort of my, before highly criticizing the Americans, that's my caveat, that all democracies are, in need of renewal, in need of vigilance, in need of, in some ways, improvement around a whole range of things. In this academic model, they have this idea that there are four things that you can really boil the healthiness of a democracy down to. And that's a rejection of the rules of democracy or a weak commitment to those rules, a denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, the tolerance or encouragement of violence, and the readiness to curtail the civil liberties of an opponent. Maybe even with taunts like lock her up. This idea that your opponents aren't really deserving of the same treatment as you, that your opponents are of a different sort of species almost to yourself. But today you could focus on a lot about the press in regard to the legitimacy of opponents, the toleration of violence. But I'm going to focus largely on the rules of the game. This commitment to the democratic process, as we're so close to an election, I think this is the thing that probably makes most sense because it's closest in our minds, and it's probably what I know the most about. So in the book, it has a more detailed thing. I don't think anyone's got a telescope or binoculars on them that they can read that, but if you want to get into the fine detail, they wrote this book before the 2020 election, predicting many of the things that would transpire. So it was a very prophetic book, and it was a bestseller, and it provides a good basis. If we're comparing the rules of the American electoral system, both at the federal level and the state level, the things I want to go through is thinking about the day. There might be an argument to say, look, the fact that we know the exact date of the next American election is a preferable thing. My joke at the beginning might be, well, that's one area where maybe the Americans have, there could be an argument to say that's superior to having, a fixed day is sort of superior to having a variable day. I know using those terms makes people with mortgages probably a bit nervous. I probably should use a floating day or an uncertain day. And then I'm going to talk about the rule makers, the place of the Federal Electoral Commission in Australia, the Australian Electoral Commission, the New South Wales Electoral Commission. The strength of those organisations, I think, is a great sort of strength of the systems in Australia. The fact that many of the rules are made by elected officials in the United States, particularly secretaries of state, this strange position of this person who's the electoral rule maker. They don't get to go on foreign policy adventures or trips like Anthony Blinken. They're firmly sort of this person who oversees elections and a lot of the regulations at the state level to do with sort of the rules of government, the rules of democracy, the drawing up of electoral boundaries. Courts are very involved in American electoral boundary decisions. We'll talk a little bit about that. How you register to vote, voter ID. I want to talk a bit about criminals and voting, those in prison. There's some interesting comparisons between the US and Australia in this regard. Voting before elections, postal voting. One of the things that I found fascinating about the last American election during COVID, the last presidential election, was how hard it was to vote before the election. You'd think that was a good idea, you won't catch COVID, you'll send it in the mail. They made it really difficult in Texas, where counties were only allowed to have one drop-off box. Now, anyone who's obsessed with American politics or geography will know that there's some tiny, tiny counties in Texas. So you might think, well, it wouldn't be that far to drive to one. But on the border, where there is a lot of Hispanic voters, there were very large counties, only one electoral box. You'd think during a pandemic that wasn't particularly sane, given public health issues, but it was politically calculated to make it hard for certain people to vote. The placement of booths. Some of you are going to go to look this up over the next few days and think, well, where is my local booth? It might be a bit different to the federal booth where I voted. I'm going to have to take my son, who's first time voting, to our local booth. In America, that is often placed in a very political way, away from public transport or close to public transport, depending on who might make the decision. The thing that many of us probably remember about American elections visually is people waiting in line for a long time. That's actually quite abnormal, but where it does occur, in some big cities in the United States, people waiting for up to 6 hours seems to me to be very egregious. This seems to be not a sign of a healthy democracy, but it's certainly not the norm, but there are these places where it occurs where I think it's unfortunate. The nature of ballots in America is a fascinating little topic to get into. I went down a rabbit hole for many hours this week looking at this thing called the butterfly ballot in Florida, which I'd lectured on many times, but I got into the voting equipment in America, which I'll show you a few photos, few slides of. The counters and the counting, the scrutineers, and then the certifying and handing over power. So that's what ahead of us. I'll try to keep on time. I've got my phone to keep well disciplined and not talk too long. Okay, election days, clearly not just about fates and getting a sausage sizzle and talking to those who are on the school committee or seeing. I saw some tremendous school art last time. Students were doing heroes, and one person had their mother as their hero, which was quite charming in many regards. The day itself, is there something preferable to have a predictability, a fixed cycle like the states have in Australia, or is it better to have, like the federal government does, a floating date where, due to double disillusion, due to maybe a want to go a bit earlier because of the fortunes of the polls, you can call an election earlier? I think there's probably, in my view, something preferable to a more fixed dates, but that's harder in a Westminster system as opposed to the American system of having a sort of divided government, having a separation of powers. What day should elections be on? Many of you probably don't like the idea of an election on a Tuesday and think that's a bad idea. About a quarter, I think, maybe a third of American states have a holiday now on that date. But it is very difficult for people sometimes working on that date. Saturdays sound a good idea until you think, well, lots of people work on a Saturday. Why did the British have it on a Thursday? Why the French on a Sunday? Often due to religious reasons or a lack of consideration of religious reasons, or people getting from church on Sunday in America, having a day to get to the polls, so the election is on a Tuesday, but why after the first Monday? So all of these things, if you're an election nerd like myself, are of fascination and issues you could debate. The thing that I think is a little bit more substantial and probably the crucial area of difference between, say, the New South Wales or the Australian systems of election and American systems is that you have elected officials, parties, governors, legislatures, and this one individual who has enormous amounts of power, who's directly elected by the people, the Secretary of State of a particular state. Kathleen Harris might be a name that comes to mind for some of you in 2000 in Florida. And that person has the capacity to determine a whole range of things about elections, help draw up election boundaries, place ballot boxes, place the number of booths where they are, early voting rules, has a lot of determination, which in Australia is largely handled by the New South Wales Electoral Commission or the Australian Electoral Commission. So in the 2020 election, this figure, who I've got a photo of, became for some people a hero for doing his job, for standing up and saying, no, this was actually the total of votes in our state, and we're not going to discount certain votes because they were from an area that was unfavourable to a particular candidate. We're just going to have to report what the facts are. We're going to have to go with the vote tally that's been scrutinised and that we've got to recognise. So some of you who follow these things very closely might recognise that figure as the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, who gained a lot of attention and a lot of pressure from the president of the time, Donald Trump, ringing him up, telling him to find more votes, to discount certain votes from certain places, to not trust the official result of the scrutineers. I would seemingly think that in Australia this is impossible to occur. We don't have an equivalent of the Secretary of State. I think it's probably very good that we don't, probably on the top of our sort of tongues, have the name of the head of the New South Wales Electoral Commission and think, well, if only that person could be pressurised, or their staff, or the fact that these people work in a fairly anonymous way as not elected officials, I think is vastly preferable. One of the things that those who study American elections and compare them to Australian elections often get really sort of agitated about it or excited about, in my case, are electoral boundaries. And all of these boundaries are what you might call crimes against geography. I was thinking when I was looking for fonts, that's probably a crime against PowerPoint, my font there, as I've randomly come across something to use there. But if you look at those maps, these are not natural electorates, they're not communities of sort of closeness. They're drawn to maximise the seats of one party in a state or federally over another party. And the aim of these seats and their strangeness, almost some of them looking a bit like a salamander, is to pack as many voters from one party into them and then distribute the voters from the other party across the state. So you often, when you think of gerrymandering, you think, well, surely they want to get as many of their supporters in the electorate. So you're sort of, instead of voters choosing politicians, politicians choose voters. That's often how you think of it in an instinctive way. That's really not how it's working at the moment. It's usually working to pack your opponent's voters into the sort of smallest number of electorates possible, really maximise their votes so they win by huge majorities. So the incumbents of those seats are quite happy because they don't really have any worry about facing a competitive election, but you minimise their influence across the state. So if you look at the example from the Washington Post, the Democrats won 9 of the 10 most gerrymandered districts in the United States that were drawn by Republicans. So Republicans have become very good at this fine sort of art of gerrymandering for maximising political benefit. And these are done not by electoral commissions, these are done by elected politicians. Politicians get to design these electorates. Now, how do they do this with such precision? A point I probably should make before moving on is when you register to vote in the United States, this is not something you're chased down by letters in the mail saying, have you moved address? And you're thinking, how do they know I've moved address? I should enroll in my new electorate in Australia. You have to go and chase down the people to let you register. And you generally register as one of 3 things in most states. You register either as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. There's a little bit of variation, but that's a standard pattern. Now, why would you want to declare that? Why would you want to go into an office and tell people what you are? Some of you might think, I'd want to keep it secret. This is an invasion of privacy, un-Americans into privacy. Well, you register because it allows you to vote in primaries. So if you live in one of these gerrymandered districts, general elections aren't that much use. You basically know who's going to win before every single election. But you may want to agitate against the sitting candidate and get someone more to your liking, further to the left, further to the right, someone that you know personally, someone that you've donated money to. And so you want to be registered as a Republican or a Democrat, often to vote in primaries. If you're registered to the other party, you can't vote in party primaries. So with that registration, it makes people very trackable to addresses, and then with computers, you can draw very precise electorates which benefit one party over the other. So to think about gerrymandering a little bit more with a kind of little spatial map, the fourth diagram is really useful to think with this computer technology and knowing where Democrats and Republicans live in their registration, you draw these deliberate lines so you can see that the group on the left, the red group, only has 40% of registered people in, say, this district or this electorate. And by drawing the map to a certain benefit to you, you can win 3 out of the 5 seats in that state. You could win 3 out of the 5 electorates, as we'd call it, in that state. So it's a pretty useful art, a dark art, but a pretty useful art if you're wanting to maximize your political power. There's a sort of heavy use of this across the United States. Generally, the state that has control of the state legislature gerrymanders its state seats and the federal seats to its benefit. But there are exceptions to this, and those exceptions are the things in some ways that are the weirdest or the strangest thoughts to me, because you'd think, well, if both parties are doing it, they're kind of going to cancel each other out, but one party, the Republican Party, has been more say adventurous, maybe you could say more anti-democratic, less concerned about maybe fairness than the Democrats. Not in all states. The Democrats have been pretty effective at this in some of the western states of the United States, but in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, the Republicans have been very effective in states that we call sort of swing states or purple states, because they're a bit, red as the Republicans, strangely. This was a sort of kind of just an accident of television, putting the parties in the 1990s as coloured. We usually think of red parties as parties of the left, but in America, the red party is the party of the right, and the Democrats are the blue party. So in those 50-50 states, those states that swing, it's extraordinary when one party can win 60 or 65% of the congressional seats. That tells us that something interesting is going on with boundaries. It's easier to pack Democrats into seats because they tend to live with other Democrats in cities. So there's a geography that makes this easier. But this pattern is really interesting that in this map, that a state like New York, where you'd think, well, isn't New York a strong Democrat state? They've got a Democrat governor, Democrat senators. How come there's a bit of a bias towards the Republicans in that state? Doesn't make so much sense what's going on. One of the interesting stories about the last election in terms of drawing boundaries was that state parties often in their secretaries of state, their legislatures, their governors, want to get their hands on maps, and they do want to maximise their benefits for one party over another. So the party in power wants to continue to stay in power by creating these gerrymandered maps. But often these things now go to courts, or they have for quite some time, go to courts, and courts can sometimes overturn these decisions. So in the lead up to the 2022 midterms, there were a number of states where there were these fairly, I would call, undemocratic maps or gerrymandered maps, and courts decided against them. So a good example was Ohio, where the Republicans had drawn the lines to benefit themselves dramatically, and the court threw that out. And in New York, the Democrats had drawn the lines to benefit themselves quite dramatically. But the Republicans didn't accept the court decision. They just went ahead with the new lines, and the Democrats did accept the court decision, redrew the map, and the reason there's probably a Republican majority at the moment is because the Republicans won a number of seats in New York, and a very thin majority. And you might think, well, aren't the Democrats stupid? You know, isn't that, why play by the rules when the other side isn't playing by the rules? If you get back to the sort of democratic theory I started with, once you throw out the rules, what does it say about you as a party? Your commitment to democratic principles. So there's a good debate to be, an interesting debate to be had there. The Democrats, I think, thought they could win on the new map anyway, but they didn't. So there was an interesting story in New York. So I've talked a little bit about registering to vote as a political party member, or at least registering as identifying with a particular party, and you can change that over time. If you're particularly Machiavellian, you may want to vote in the primaries of the party you hate the most and vote for the candidate that you think is the worst or the most extreme, and then when that candidate gets elected in the primaries, then talk about how terrible that party is because they elected this person who should never have been elected. And the Democrats got into a bit of that in New Hampshire in the recent midterms, trying to get engaged in electing some of the most conspiratorial Republicans with very strong views. Republican voters have done this in primaries for the Democrats in Michigan and elsewhere over the years. So this system is open to a lot of quirks and a lot of behaviour that might not see as entirely desirable. One of the fascinating things about the US in terms of voter turnout, you would have thought, well, it's not a very interesting story in Australia, voter turnout when voting is compulsory. Still lots of people don't turn out. Registration, of course, in Australia is incredibly high, but registration in America isn't particularly high. But those who register do tend to vote. So there's a really decent turnout. It's just getting people registered is hard, or there's a hardcore group of people who are just really disengaged from the political process. The other sort of side note to make before I move on to sort of comparative international statistics, I've got a couple of sort of graphs and diagrams there. In America, there's been a lot of talk about voter fraud. All academic research on this topic in Australia and in the United States, many other democracies, shows that voter fraud is incredibly low. There's just no really decent hard evidence to show that lots of people want to vote twice or lots of dead people are on electoral rolls. Voter fraud, there's just not hard evidence for it, and it's reasonably easy to sort of check electoral rolls at various times. So there's a kind of exaggeration of voter fraud. And one of the responses to this exaggeration has been to say, well, people should bring ID. If people bring ID to vote, what's wrong with that? That's a simple little process. You show your driver's license, you show some sort of ID. Clearly, there's a group of people who don't have ID as easily, so it's seen as discriminatory against that group of people. So people say, well, you should use a variety of IDs. And in Texas, in the last midterm elections, there was a big debate over which IDs are allowed and which IDs aren't allowed. And student IDs, which universities issue, weren't allowed, but gun licenses were allowed. So these kind of many quirks and differences in the system, and these things are often not by happenstance. They are deliberate calculations, made by politicians, not by electoral commissions, as I've said a number of times. Okay, this is a microscopic thing for those who've got sort of special powers, but the sort of story that I'm telling you there is the one I was suggesting before. In Australia, there's a very high rate of voter registration, but not the highest vote of voting. Uruguay in the last election had a higher turnout. Americans have a lot of turnout for those who are registered, but not particularly impressive in terms of overall population. Okay, criminals and voting. This is where we really start to get into stereotypes about Americans and how true they are and how many people are in jail. And, you know, some, I think, sort of perceptions might be that every person who's ever committed a felon offence, a term we don't use here, but a sort of serious criminal offence, can never vote in America. That's not true. Only in Virginia and Tennessee is that the case, that you're wiped off the roll forever. In the 2000 election, where George W. Bush won, and his brother was governor of Florida at the time, there were people who had the names of people who had been criminals in other states wiped off the roll in an attempt to purge some of the rolls of felons, because Florida only recently had a referendum deciding that ex-felons could vote, but that hasn't gone through entirely. The current governor of Florida isn't entirely on board with this, and there's a lot of people still in a sort of wait column based on the fact that it's claimed that they haven't cleared their debts and obligations from their criminal prosecutions. So there's ways of slowing up the entry of felons back into the voting process. In Australia, I've got a nice thing from the Australian Electoral Commission. People in jail who don't have sentences over 3 years can vote. We're not talking enormous numbers in Australia. In New South Wales, if your sentence is over 1 year, you can't vote. So there was a High Court case saying there needed to be some sort of continuous connection with the community, and the federal law was established at 3, but in New South Wales it's 1, in Victoria I believe it's 3, in the ACT and in South Australia you can vote no matter what your sentence is in prison. So there's a variation in Australia, but we're not talking enormous numbers in Australia. Where in the US, the numbers, I started to crunch a few of the numbers over the last kind of few days just because I'm fascinated in mass incarceration and elections, and I was surprised, well maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, how many people were ex-felons in a state like Florida. So Florida is arresting a lot of people each year, and that accumulated effect over 20, 30 years, the lifetime of many individuals, means that if you look at the number of ex-felons in Florida, you've got about 1.4 million ex-felons. And in the last presidential election, about 11 million people voted. Florida's pretty similar population size to Australia. That was, out of registered voter population of 13.5 million registered voters. So ex-felons are making up almost 10% of registered voters, which is an extraordinary number. So you're talking a very large number of people being either enfranchised or disenfranchised. And the referendum was interesting because both the Republicans and Democrats thought they might potentially benefit from ex-felons. It wasn't clear that all of these people would suddenly be Democrat voters or Republican voters. So there was there was a muddiness to the referendum. If there was data showing that the vast majority of them are going to vote for the Democrats particularly, I think there would have been a much stronger campaign against them, and probably the referendum would have struggled to get up. So it's all of these things have a political flavour to them, which I'd suggest they shouldn't. Okay, so the method of voting. That simple pencil and paper of the Australian system is not to be underrated. There's a lot to be said for just having that little pencil, that simple ballot, bigger on the federal Senate paper where you've, if you're like me, occasionally you number from your least favourite to your favourite, and this becomes a very long process that your kids wonder what the hell you're doing in there, and you're there for ages. But in the American system, ballots are designed with great variety across states. Some states using electronic systems. I might mention Dominion and their voting machines, and their case with Fox News at the moment that some of you may be following. But in the 2000 election, you got to see this great variety and the faults of it, of having county by county or state by state election designs. And the one that the election came down to, because it was so close, just a matter of hundreds of people in that state of Florida that I mentioned before, a state of millions of people, 10 or so million people voting, and the election really coming down to 200 or 100 votes either way in a few counties in Florida. And this was the design of the ballot, sort of almost designed to confuse. In a state with lots of elderly people who are losing their sight like myself, people who may not sort of pay attention to where the arrows are and vote in the wrong spots, people who were, disgusted by Pat Buchanan's arguments about the Holocaust, some degree of Holocaust denialism, accidentally voting for him. Large number of Jewish voters in Florida. This would have been, I think, very disturbing, and it was part of the process. Now, this ballot looks bad, but I think it starts to get worse when you think about the equipment that you vote with. You're in this booth and you've got this large book because you're voting for many of things. You're voting for federal positions, you're voting for your Secretary of State, you're voting for the Attorney General, you might even be voting for the local sheriff, the dog catcher, you're voting on some referenda items, whether you allow legalized marijuana, casino money to be used for funding schools. You've got a lot to get through, a lot of reading, and you're poking a little hole in the case of that ballot with this little kind of pencil-like thing on a chain. And as you're poking it through, you get this thing which you see with the magnifying glass, you get this ballot card. And the problem with the machine and the poking it through, and they're quite old, not always did you perforate it properly. So not always did you get a clean punch. Sometimes the ballot was hanging, and you had the little bit of paper was hanging, and the paper was known as a chad. There's a great cartoon after the 2000 election, which was, who hung Chad and why, sort of America. I think it was the time of Twin Peaks, who killed Laura Palmer, who sort of hung Chad was the line that was in the press. And this was remarkable to many people around the world, that you have this highly sophisticated technological society, very wealthy, and everything is sort of literally hanging on whether this piece of paper has a thread that fell, or the pen was a little bit defective, or it was hard to push it through the ballot card because you had so many other things you were voting for, and whether a hanging chad is an intention or not an intention. A Supreme Court case was fought partly on this issue, largely on not counting those hanging chads, but the Democrats wanted them to be counted. The Republicans didn't, because the Democrats were behind on election night by about 350 votes, and the Republicans were ahead, and the election came down to that one state. And maybe if the hanging chads as opposed to the chads had been counted, Gore would have won and Bush would have lost. So the lot depended on this. From the outside, I think, the pencil and little paper looks pretty good in comparison to the hanging chads and the punch card and those electoral sort of systems. The other part of the elections that I sort of have great sympathy for are those people on Saturday who were going to see handing out those pieces of paper and pencils and ballots and taking our name, the scrutineers and the counters and the people who are announcing the results to the electoral commissions. I mean, those people, in my mind, should be treated with great respect. They're doing something that's really important for our civic culture, for our democracy. And one of the things that really troubled me about the January 6 hearings that I listened to a lot of was that some of those people working in electoral booths, counting up the results, handing out the papers, doing that important work, were targeted online, that their names were found out and that they were abused. They were threatened with violence, that they became the targets of partisan politicking and conspiracy theories. And this was, I think, one of the many troubling things that emerged after the 2020 US election, that there was a sense of a disrespect for those who are working in what should be really the anonymous good work of democracy. Okay, I'm coming to an end. Hopefully I'm reasonably on time. I think I'm sort of the last thing I wanted to talk about is the certifying of election results. When it's all over, that important process of tabulating them, counting them up, no preferential system, so it should be pretty straightforward. In the United States, well, very few places where there's any preferential voting. The important role of the media in this. I mean, not many of us are probably tuned into the Australian Electoral Commission or the New South Wales Electoral Commission website and just watching that alone. Probably most of us have got a television station on. We trust these anchors. We trust their Anthony Green and his models. These things play an enormous role, and that's an enormous responsibility. And I suppose those who have followed the Dominion case against Fox News realise that that responsibility can be abused. That responsibility can be treated as though it's just a commercial decision. And in the case of Fox, there were news outlets further to the conspiratorial right which were claiming that Biden had unfairly won, and to keep their market share as they saw it, they thought it was necessary to play in those waters of lies rather than just report the facts. And sometimes your favoured party loses and sometimes it wins. And a crucial part of democracy is having the capacity to accept that. To be able to be a good loser is democracy in some ways relies upon that. And that's a key finding of how democracies die. In the American system, you have this very kind of unusual role of the elector. So votes are actually passed through a group of people who are almost guardians of the public, of the electorate, and they can behave faithfully or unfaithfully. Now, it doesn't generally occur, but there is the capacity for an elector, who is largely a ceremonial position in a lot of states, but not all states, to say the people got it wrong this time. They shouldn't have voted for Biden. I really like Sanders, or I really like Kanye West, and that's where they should have gone. And that is a gremlin. That is a weakness in the system which has a long sort of historical kind of reasoning that the people sometimes will get whipped up by populists to make the wrong decision. There were some people when Trump won in 2016 saying the electors should turn against that election. They shouldn't follow the popular will. The public got whipped up in the wrong direction. I wouldn't have supported it in either way. They're not there as guardians in the way that maybe some people who didn't have much faith in the public wanted when the US Constitution was created in the 18th century. I've talked about Secretary of State, legislatures, governors, House of Representatives can all play a role in certification. There was a myth going around in the 2020 election that the vice president was the key decider, and therefore if you got rid of the vice president, you could overturn the election, an extraordinary idea. Mike Pence wasn't too far away from those people I started with invading the Capitol building. The idea that if Mike Pence was eliminated, killed, that the election would have been overturned was one of those, I think, just highly sort of problematic and scary ideas that got into the discourse in the 2020 election. Lastly, sitting presidents have to be able to accept when they've lost. They play a crucial role in transitions. And as I said, losing parties, losing voters. That is the next talk, is it? It's getting on the slides. Thank you for your time, and hopefully you have lots of questions. I'm welcome to answer any of them. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Well, we're very mindful of time because we don't have very much time now for questions, but we will move into that. But firstly, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I think we've learned so much. It's been very fascinating as well. I've picked up on some things that I didn't know about in the past. And I want to confess that I have used that font as well on a PowerPoint. So we'd love to have some questions from the audience, and my colleague Joseph will run around with a microphone to take questions from you.
Thanks for that talk. You mentioned that New South Wales or Australia doesn't have much electoral fraud. How much effort goes into determining that as a fact as opposed to in America?
I think it's a bigger industry, definitely, in the US. I mean, there's an electoral fraud police squad in Florida. Some might say it's not as necessary as other forms of policing, but there's a lot of attention that gets given to it. But there's a whole branch of American political science kind of dedicated to this. So there's a lot of really well-regarded publications on this topic because it's an important topic, and there's a lot of people claiming fraud. So there's been a lot of people researching it at the very best American universities and the best publications. There's not the same degree of people claiming it in Australia. So there's been, I think, maybe not as much research as there might have been. It certainly doesn't compare at all to the American situation in terms of the amount of research. So you could say it's an understudied area, but I think to defend my own profession, we would say, well, it's an area where there's no great evidence. There needs to be a lot of study. There might be more useful things to study, but you're right that I couldn't run off a list of great electoral fraud scholars in this country where there are in America.
Oh, that's one voice. The topic was democracy in crisis. Do you think it is? They're objecting that before too long, 35% of the population will be able to elect the majority of the Senate, for example.
Yeah, I think the US system is in crisis because you have an element of the Republican Party that's no longer that committed to democracy if it loses. So I think that point I made at the end that democracy's only really healthy when there's a tradition of graceful acceptance of losses. And there's increasingly an element of the Republican Party that doesn't want to play by any rules that are vaguely neutral or set by courts or arbitrators, commissions. They want to create the rules, so that's the part of the story where those state secretaries are really important, is that there are people who are running for election saying that Biden was illegitimately elected and that he shouldn't be president. And if those people get in the wrong positions, a lot of those people lost in the midterms. So there were Republican voters who said, this is going too far. We're going to vote for the Republican governor, but we're not going to vote for the state secretary who's claiming the last election was a fraud because it goes against fundamental principles. But if there are not enough people to do that, and there was a lot of this going on in Arizona, a real hotbed of activity, if you get the wrong people in the wrong places in the American system, the capacity to overturn the popular will is very high. So I think in the next 10 years, there will be an election even more disputed potentially than the Trump 2020 election, where the wrong person, not a Brad Raffensperger, is there and says, no, actually, these people in Atlanta, shouldn't be counted. We can't trust the scrutineers, we can't trust the totals. We'll just put the Atlanta votes to the side, and if we get rid of Atlanta, actually Trump won Georgia. And that occurs in lots of places we call dictatorships or authoritarian states. There was an election like that a few years back in Côte d'Ivoire, which led up into the International Criminal Court as it led to ethnic killing of a particular group who weren't counted in the electorate. So that's usually the sort of thing, if someone said that about America, you'd think this person's a conspiracy theorist. But we're seeing the groundwork, people wanting to behave like that. So that's why I see it as a crisis.
Thank you much for this interesting overview, I would like to look at the fundamentals, okay, and some confusion with the Western, I'll be free to say honestly, propaganda. I want to challenge the definition of democracy. How can we think that it's democracy, but first it's actually representative, so it's far from democracy, not taking into account corruption, and the problem is the system. If the system is corrupt, it doesn't matter what are the individuals. But how can we call this democracy if it's not proportional? Like example here in Australia, we have the Greens who have about 13%, plus minus, and they have very few, representatives, particularly in the position where they can decide. Yeah. So it's far from democracy. Yeah. We have to be honest, because nothing happens without honesty. Yeah. We many times call something democracy, which was like, before the Athenian democracy, there was 3,500 years BC in what is now Baghdad, Iraq, which was democracy, but it was not real.
I mean, I agree with you, and I started my talk by saying democracy can always be improved. You can make your society better, hopefully informed, they can be more engaged, you can argue about the systems, whether you should have, where I come from, the proportional representation system of New Zealand or Germany, as opposed to the first past the post system, or the system that Australia has of rank voting. So there's all sorts of systems you can argue about, and you can argue some are far superior to others. But what I'm talking about tonight is really the base. What's the floor of what you can call yourself a democracy? And when you go lower than that floor, what are you? And in its most sort of base form, America is operating in its better years as a form of democracy. It's maybe not the best form, and there may be many faults with it, but I still think I would use that word. There are some who no longer have that commitment. And President Trump was one of those people after the last election who no longer had a commitment to what you might call, you might even call it a minimal democracy. But at least it was still a democracy where the will of the people, through what is a very peculiar system. The Electoral College is a very peculiar historical system. But the rules are there, and if you follow the rules, sometimes the Republicans win, sometimes the Democrats win. But when you lose, you accept it. And so that might have, in 10 years ago, that would be a very boring talk. But hopefully it was a bit more animating because of what have happened in 2020.
We'll take one last question.
This might seem to be a bit of a left field question. We've heard a lot over the years of gerrymandering and so on in the state level and the federal level. Does anything like that happen in the local government area with ward boundaries, city boundaries, county boundaries?
In the US? Yeah, so, I'm not an expert on US local government, so I wouldn't venture too far into it. But I think wherever there's a capacity, plenty of this is going on. So this is, if you don't have electoral commissions, I'm not from the Australian Electoral Commission, but I give them a big sort of pat on the back for the work they do in the New South Wales Electoral Commission, that when you have people that are committed as non-partisans, and I think that's a fundamental difference between our system and the American system, is there's in America almost a mindset that you cannot be a non-partisan. Everyone is a partisan. Everyone is either a Democrat or a Republican or on their way to becoming a Democrat or a Republican or switching. Where in the Australian system, having people who are first working for the commission as their job and not seeing it through a party lens, I think is really crucial. Where in America, if you know the history of city politics in Chicago or in New York, Chicago particularly, there was a time when the person who collected the garbage was known to be a Democrat, and that's how they got the job. And the county, the city council employment was based on a political machine. And so that is a very different tradition, and a tradition that doesn't also trust courts. The courts, the people are appointed by a particular party, so even a judge is never really neutral. A judge is of a particular brand. And that tradition, I think, is very difficult for democracies. And so there's a lot, I think, to be said for people who pride themselves at doing their job before party. And that is, I think, for Americans quite a difficult concept to grasp, even in throughout the bureaucracy of the United States, where there are people who are, permanent public servants. There's this still much more politicized situation. So you allowed me to talk about one of my other pet topics, but on city politics, I'm sure you could find many more expert people in the US than I am.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I'm sure you could have asked lots more questions, but we'll have to just save that for another day, or if you have a few moments, but we'll try not to keep you after this has ended. I would like to thank Professor O'Connor. I think it is wonderful that he's made time to share his insights with us, and in such an interesting way as well. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Speaker too, who's dedicated his time to be here tonight at what we know is a very busy time at the moment for our elected representatives. So we also want to thank Mr. Speaker because, of course, he's also always incredibly supportive of all our events that we have organised throughout the year. So perhaps everyone can join me in thanking Professor O'Connor and Mr. Speaker. And also thank you to all of you tonight for taking the time to be with us today and your interesting and thoughtful questions. And I hope you've enjoyed the program. I wanted to mention, and I forgot to take the clicker with me, but we'll click over to the next slide. This will be the next presentation that we will be giving in this election series. This will be the final in the series, and it's a wrap-up by Anthony Green, and it will be held after the elections on the 27th of April. So I hope that you will be interested in that one as well, and please scan the QR codes around the room or pick up the little handout that some of you have on your seats to register for subscription to get further information. And I also wanted to mention we have two wonderful books at the back of the room that we are selling, one which is a cookbook from the Parliament and one which is the history of the oldest Parliament in Australia, our Parliament of New South Wales. So I hope you might like to pick one of those up or both of them as coffee table books. Thank you very much tonight.